Salam and welcome to Season 3 of In Conversation, in association with Reorient Journal and the Critical Muslim Studies Project. In our first episode, Ismail Patel is in conversation with Sylviane Diouf on enslaved Muslims in the Americas.
Today I have a guest whose work has been focused on the Atlantic slavery, but her work is not like other. She has looked to explore and expose details most academics only provide a cursory attention to, or even most likely disregard. She has an eye for details, and that has made her an award-winning historian of African descendants. She is a visiting scholar at Brown University Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice, a curator, and she is an author. And two books are of great interest for us here. Slavery's Exile, the story of the American Maroons, and the second one, Servants African Muslims enslaved in the Americas. I'm honored to be in conversation with Dr. Sylviane Diouf. So welcome and thank you, Dr. Sylviane Diouf, for joining us. Again, good morning.
Good morning and thank you.
Well, let's start our conversation by talking a little bit about yourselves. Maybe you'd like to fill us in with your intellectual journey that have brought you towards studying the enslaved people in the Americas, and particularly the Muslim community.
Well, I grew up in France. My father was from Senegal, and my mother is French. And I grew up really, in an environment that, I didn't know anything about racism. And then I saw on TV what was going on in the United States, in the 60s, those horrible violence against African Americans, who were demanding civil rights. And I was very young, and I was also very shocked, and I didn't understand what was going on there. And so little by little, I tried to inform myself, and I discovered, and really it was a discovery. I discovered slavery because I had never heard of that, as I was growing up in France. It was not part, of the curriculum. There was nothing. And so that, I found that extremely distressful and interesting as well. And so when I went to university, that's what I studied, and I did my dissertation on resistance to slavery and the slave trade. And as I was, I read hundreds, thousands of books on slavery and the slave trade, and I never found Muslims there. As I mentioned, my father was from Senegal. He was Muslim.
Was he a Muslim then?
Pardon me?
Was one of your parents Muslim?
Yes, my father.
Okay.
My father was Muslim, and he was actually, from a family who had been Muslim for centuries. Actually, one of our ancestors founded one of the largest and oldest Islamic university in Senegal. That was 1503. And, whenever, I knew that there would have been Muslims among the people who were the victims of the transatlantic slave trade, because, many of them came from regions where Islam was implanted, but they didn't see anything. So I said, okay, so let me try and understand who they were and what happened to them once, they arrived in the Americas. And so that's what gave birth to my book, Servants of Allah, which was first published in 1998.
Okay. So would you say that obviously looking at slavery for somebody from Europe at that stage would have been sort of to be a pariah academic anyway, But then to look at Muslims, was it because of your dad or something else triggered you to look into the potential?
Yes, I mean, I was very intrigued by, this, by the fact that people who arrived in the Americas, it seemed like they had disappeared, and that, if there was any mention of them, it was really about this thing that, when they discovered the real religion, they converted, and that was the end of it. So I've always been very interested in people's story.
Okay.
I'm a social historian, and so what interests me is how people lived, how they, what they did, not what was done to them mostly, but what they did in the circumstances, in the terrible circumstances that they found themselves in. And this was really a topic that was not covered when I started my research. There was one book which was a source book about some enslaved Muslims in the United States and in Jamaica. I think it was just text. There was nothing in terms of explaining, of etc. And then there was one biography of an African Muslim, and to me that was interesting. But the thing is that you could say, well, those were a few exceptional people.
Yes.
And what I was interested in was, a larger view about families, about communities. And for that, I needed, in my view, to look at the continent, at the Western Hemisphere. So not only the United States, but the entire, the Caribbean, South America, to see who those Muslims were and what they were doing and how they or not continue to follow their religion.
Sure. So you've had to do a lot of digging. You've made it very clear there. But just to something on the side, would you say that more accounts of the enslaved people have been left by Muslims than any other community that were enslaved?
Absolutely, because the thing, of course, is that a lot of those Muslims had been to school. They could read and write, and some had been to really higher studies, and so they have left manuscripts. And what I did, when I was doing my research, I looked into French, Spanish, Portuguese, and English sources. But there were also, yes, that was that was the good thing, when you speak French and Italian, as I do, and I studied Latin, so Spanish and Portuguese were kind of easy. But so that's one thing. But there were also manuscripts in Arabic, which I do not either speak or read. And they also left some documents, some manuscripts in Ajami, so their own languages, in the Arabic script.
That is very interesting, because we can understand them writing in sort of Spanish and Portuguese and other languages to transmit information amongst themselves. But once the slaves started writing in their native language, where they came from, or Arabic, meant that they were trying to preserve some information for maybe a future generation. Would you say that's a right reading on that?
So actually, they did not write in in European languages. The sources that I mentioned were actually all written by by travelers, by journalists, by intellectuals, by slaveholders, etc.
Okay.
And what is interesting also, and that is the case, which is, when you write about people who were enslaved and who actually were not able to write themselves, then you have to use, the kind of European or white American sources, and you have to always kind of, read against the grain, read between the lines. So that was one thing. But for the Muslims themselves, they did write, in Arabic or in Hausa, and so they were writing for themselves, for their community. And what we see in several of those manuscripts, which have been translated since, is really this. For example, I have this man, Kaba in Jamaica, who wrote like a 50-page manuscript, and
Okay.
it's all about preserving Islam. It's all about different rights. How people, write about marriage and how to preserve the
Are you talking
community.
about the man?
But yes. And
yeah.
so
yes.
Yes, yeah. And there was also a manuscript that was written in the United States, in Georgia, in the 1850s, and again, which has been preserved. And it's part of a text. It's part of a 1200 text by and it's about ablutions, it's about prayer, etc. And there's a whole corpus actually. Of manuscripts written by Muslims that exist. In January 1835, there was a large Muslim uprising in Bahia, in Brazil, and there are plenty of documents that have been preserved. And there was plan for revolt, and there were communication, between the insurgents. So it's very, very rich, and it's really the only cases of writing by enslaved people in the Americas at the moment that they were still enslaved.
Okay. Would you say, sorry to interrupt you, but would you say the uprising that you mentioned in Bahia in Brazil, would you say that's an exception, or would you say the Muslims put forward a greater resistance, the Muslim slaves put up a greater resistance to slavery than other African slaves?
So it's really interesting because, let me first mention, about numbers, because, so the transatlantic slave trade deported about 12.5 million Africans. About 10,700,000 arrived in the Americas because, about 2.5 million died during the voyage. The estimates of the Muslims in this among the Africans is, it's very hard to determine. We know that there were hundreds of thousands. One of the estimates is about 700. Is about 7%. So that's still 900,000 Muslims. And what we see, for example, there's a database of 30,000 voyages of the slave trade. And what we see there is that Senegambians, so we're talking about people, in Senegal, Gambia, and, kind of part of Mali, etc. They were not that numerous as compared, for example, from people from Congo, but the they had the highest rate of resistance and revolt on the slave ships and on the coast as well. And particularly, we see that in the 1770s, that was the highest percentage of revolts, and that was also the time of the Islamic movements there, and and we had people who had fought for their religion and who found themselves enslaved, because they had been made prisoners. And so there's, this question of the fact also is that because Muslims cannot be enslaved, if you will, there's this prohibition of enslaving Muslims within the religion. So that was probably also one thing, to be enslaved and being enslaved by Christians on top of it. So we had people
sorry, can you clarify that? You mean being educated, or?
No, the fact that that when you're a Muslim, you cannot be, you should not be enslaved, right?
Yes.
A free Muslim should not be enslaved. So that was one thing.
So the idea of freedom existed and percolated amongst Muslims, and they understood the difference between us being slaved and enslaved.
Absolutely, and the fact that they now were prisoners and would be enslaved by Christians, that may have been an added reason, if you will, for revolting.
Yeah, because being most, as you mentioned earlier, these people were learned, so they must have known about. They have understand there's other faiths. So
yes. Because when you look at the some, for example, once they were in the Americas, they mentioned that that they had read a lot of those books that had been translated into Arabic, and white people in several languages in Africa, they were called actually Nasara, which is people from Nazareth.
Yes. Nazarians.
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
So and interestingly also, for example, Omar Ibn Said, who was a Muslim from Senegal, who was deported to North Carolina and who left a large number of manuscripts. He said, he wrote in his, I was made a prisoner by Christians. I arrived, in the Christian country. I did not speak Christian. You see, so
yes.
Yeah.
One thing that comes to mind then, how did these Muslim slaves manage to write manuscript under slavery?
Yes, so this is really very, very interesting because, first of all, they had to have paper. And,
yes.
So they had to buy paper.
And I also assume, sorry to interrupt you, but I also assume, if you now take that question on board as well, that they must have been banned to write, because the whole idea of enslaved people was they were barbarians and therefore it was worth enslaving them.
Absolutely. And so this is a very interesting point, because writing was not allowed. And and again, they had to procure paper, they had to procure ink, and so they were, kind of, for some, actually, what they did was that they ingrained themselves, to the slaveholders, who thought, well, this particular person seems to be educated, and they gave them paper. For example, in Jamaica, the missionaries, as well as in other places, would give them paper because some of the Muslims were forced to convert, actually converted, kind of because they had to, but they continued, to be Muslims. And
so what they were showing that they had converted, but they were still practicing Islam.
Absolutely. So what they did was they, by this pseudo conversion, they gained access to paper, for example, and they continued with that paper to actually write about Islam. Others, for example, there's also a very interesting case, very, very interesting, very strange, of a man in Georgia, in the Sea Island, very isolated place, and he wrote this 13-page manuscript, and the paper was actually manufactured in Italy for the North African market.
Okay.
And and this manuscript still exists.
Okay.
And there is this question: how could he get that paper?
To
So
America.
that's one other thing. And in Brazil, the Muslims were very organized. They had asked actually a French bookseller to import Qurans and grammar books, and they bought those Qurans. They bought paper, etc., from him.
Sorry, how do you think they bartered this? If they had managed to get this across, I mean, what kind of? Obviously, they didn't have currency. So how did they barter to get Quran in exchange for what?
See, for example, in Brazil, the people who worked in the cities, what happened with them is that in many cases they would work as porters, for example, and or make food, etc. And they would be paid, and the money part of the money was given to their owners, and they would keep a part for themselves. And it is with that money that they would buy. And they were said actually to pay the Qurans and the books by installments. And yes, and
it must be a very high price then.
Yes,
relative to their income.
It would take them, sometimes a full year, to be able to actually, pay those books. But as I mentioned, they were so well organized that they had Quranic schools,
madrasas,
underground. And everything was discovered in 1835, after that uprising failed. And so in Brazil, there's a large number of manuscripts written, and it's, some of them, it's really kind of poignant, if you will. You have papers were found, in those schools, in those secret schools, of children or even adults, starting to write Arabic.
That's amazing. So that the commitment, obviously, just to preserve their faith was phenomenal. In text, which we end up, do we have any evidence of their practicality, like salah, zakat, sadaqah, these principles which are central to Islam? Do we have anything like that?
Yes, absolutely. For I'll just take one example in the United States. Again, in the Sea Islands of Georgia and South Carolina, you had people in former slaves who were interviewed in the 1930s, and they described how their grandparents were praying. They were praying 3 times a day, and they explained how they were doing that. They also talked about the fact that they had prayer beads. They mentioned that women were cloth on their head, but it was not the same cloth as the others. It was down to their shoulders. They also mentioned that several men had white cloth around their heads, turbans, and there were also slaveholders who mentioned that the Muslims were praying. So there's plenty of documentation on that. And one of the things also that I mentioned in the book, which was to me was really extraordinary, people remembered that their grandmothers gave them rice balls, and they call them saraka. And so people thought that saraka was kind of an African, quote unquote, word, meaning rice ball. And I explained, no, it's a saraka. It's and that is the kind of charity that women in West Africa, give to the children. And actually, what is interesting also is that the same word saraka or Sarah, etc., is found not only in the United States, but in the Caribbean as well as in Brazil, and up to today, some people continue to give to give charity, but not understanding where it comes from. And for example, I remember I was in Trinidad a few years ago, and I was mentioning that, and a woman came to me and she said, well, I gave Saraka last week because my mother is sick, and I wanted, and they are Christians, they don't, but they are, that has continued. And
talking about women, how much role do you think the women, Muslim women, played in preserving the culture?
So it's difficult to know. The thing is that there were few Muslim women, and because so we have, and it's always kind of the same story. We have testimonies, we have a lot of things by men or about men, but very few about women, whether they were Muslims or not. So one of the things that I mentioned is this whole Saraka thing, and we don't have much about women. For example, so far we haven't found any writing by women, of that sort of thing.
Sure. Let me sort of move the conversation and now slightly in a different direction, I suppose, into more political arena, where, of course, slavery, there are arguments by those apologetics, I suppose, in one sense, to say that, there used to be slavery in Africa. Arabs used to enslave people. So what's the difference in Americans or the Europeans carrying out slavery? What would you say to that?
Well, first of all, just in terms of the magnitude, the transatlantic slave trade was larger than all the other slave trades combined. So that's one thing. And there is no to be taken, kidnapped, or sold, from. I mean, it's the same horror everywhere. There's no question about that. So this is, there's no, we shouldn't even be, trying to see one was better or was worse than the other. Just the fact of being taken out of your family and your surroundings and your community, etc., and being sent to another country, that is the same everywhere. What is different, though, is what happened after. It's the kind of slave system that exists. And when we look, for example, at just one, the Indian Ocean, slave trade, we see things very different. For example, East Africans, from Ethiopia down to, Somalia, etc., who were sent, for example, to India, which is, I'm talking about that because I also, wrote about that, and I did,
Sure.
I made an exhibition about Africans in India. So the possibility in the Islamic world, in general, actually, is that yes, people were enslaved, but in many cases, the enslavement didn't last their whole life, because freeing a
That means the
slave
life of
is
to clarify that. So individuals were enslaved, they could buy their freedom.
They could, and freeing a slave is an act, was considered an act of pity, of piety. So people in many cases did not, live their whole life there. And, there were occupations that were actually kind of prestigious, like being guards, of the Kaaba, being soldiers. And we see that,
Yes.
for example, very clearly in India, where East Africans reached positions that were impossible to even imagine in the West. Some became architects and prime ministers and rulers, traders, etc., etc. So
just expand on that a little bit. The story of Malik ibn Ambar, the ruler of Ahmednagar.
Yes. So Malik Ambar was taken enslaved when he was still a boy. He was sent to different countries. He was also taught how to read and write, and then he arrived in India about 1570, I think, and he became. He was a soldier. He became a general. I mean, he became the de facto ruler of Ahmednagar. In the
Ahmednagar, yeah, it's called Ahmednagar.
Yes,
that's right.
And there were others, like him in Bijapur. The whole Deccan was really kind of. There were a lot of those African Muslims, and with very, very high positions. And actually, Malik Ambar was really the de facto ruler, and he was the fiercest enemy of the Mughal, and and he was not the only one. There were other.
So these are not exceptions. We are not talking about
exceptions at all. And there were even rulers, who founded princely states, And, you know, so
Sure.
those were independent states ruled by Africans. And, you know, so those things were absolutely, I mean, it was just totally impossible in the West.
Sure. Let me bring you back to the West. Because, of course, we've got limited time and we'd like to have you for a much longer time, but let's see what we can do. Going back to the Americas, how do you think, despite the great tenacity of the Muslims to uphold their faith, try and, under the sort of slavery, manage their practices and leave behind manuscript, how do you think Islam dwindled or Muslims stopped practicing in America? What was different there?
So what happened is that, you know, everywhere they were a small minority. And it was
Sure.
very difficult and for them to actually pass on the religion to their children. So that was one of the things. Also because again, you know, there were a lot of Muslim men and less Muslim women.
Mm-hmm.
And in the, you know, in the West, the separation of families was, you know, you sold the father here, you sold the mother there, the children, etc., etc. So it was more difficult, if you will, to pass on the religion to the children. And then we see even in Brazil, you know, where the Muslim communities were very, very well organized and very strong. What they were saying, you know, by the end of the 19th century, is that the children wanted, you know, and it's kind of the same thing today, if you will. The children wanted to conform, you know, to the rest of, you know, of their peers. And, you know, most people at the time, you know, were Christians. And so that's what the children kind of want, you know, to identify with the other young people. And there were also the parents were also saying, well, you know, they want to have fun. They were conscious, if you will, that the religion was kind of austere. And that the Catholics had fun, you know, they were singing, they were, you know, dancing, you know, there were all kinds of festivities, and the young people were attracted to that. And so that was one of the reasons, you know, the difficulty to pass on the religion to the generations. And
so both the difficulty, as you mentioned, both the difficulty to pass on and as well as the environment did not make it conducive for them to be able to practice their faith. And I suppose adding to that was also the stigma of being a Muslim would have been quite dangerous to declare themselves to be Muslims as being enslaved as well by mainly Christian or
yes, because, you know, there
community.
was always this push of Christianization of the people who were enslaved. And for example, for the United States, it's really after emancipation in 1865 that you know, that there was this movement to really Christianize people. And at that point, you know, the fact was that when the slave trade ended, and it ended in the United States legally in 1808, you know, so Muslims stopped getting into the Americas. The slave trade lasted much longer, you know, in Brazil and Cuba, but still. So it was really practiced by the Africans themselves, but very little, and then not at all by their children or their grandchildren.
Excellent. You know, as much as Africans are not considered part of America, the other half of that is that Islam is not considered part of Africa. How do you, what is your reading of that?
For me is that, you know, Islam has been, let's say, in West Africa for over 1,000 years. and it's been spread. I think that people have this idea that Islam was imposed by the sword on Africans, which is far from reality. It spread, as I said, about 1,000 years ago, and it was spread by local people, by local traders and clerics, and people had been in contact in West Africa with Islam earlier, through Arabs and Berbers, and it spread slowly, and then and the thing is that it did not. So it was. I think that wherever Islam went, there were religions before Islam, and nobody is saying that Islam is not an Asian religion today. Before Islam came to Afghanistan or Pakistan or India, there were religions there that people had, and it's always about Africa that people are saying, well, it came from outside, and I think it's kind of condescension that to think that people that Africans were so I don't know. So
also, I think most probably Islam came to Africa before it ever went to India.
Absolutely.
And do you think there's an element here of trying to divide and categorize Islam to a certain segment so that there's a better way of controlling or at least writing a discourse about them?
Yes, I think that it's how could I say? I think that in terms of Africans, it's what I perceive is really this trying to and we saw that with Muslims, with enslaved Muslims as well. It's always this thing of thinking that Africans are not smart enough, are not mentally competent enough to to understand what they're doing, and that
and to have made a free choice, really,
exactly,
isn't it? Sorry.
Exactly. So it's always that things have been imposed on them, whether it's Islam or it's Christianity or it's whatever, and that they are not smart enough to make their own choice.
Okay.
Yeah, that's
I mean, I think we can talk about a lot, but I want to bring you back to sort of more modern day and try and connect, if we can, the past with the present. And in your book, you mentioned Bilal, and you think that name has been corrupted to Bailey. Can we draw sort of any significance of Bilal to the new world, and in particularly the Black Lives Matter movement?
Well, actually, what happened with Bilal is that that a man whose name was Bilali Mohammed, who actually left a manuscript, his children and his grandchildren, etc., changed the name later to Bailey, and the Bailey family still is still there today, and they know who their father was. And Bilal, it's interesting because for many African American converts to Islam, Bilal was really has always been a figure that has been very key to their conversion, a very important figure in part of the reasons why they converted. And so I don't know, I'm not sure if I can make a link to the movements today, but Bilal has been
it's a symbol of resistance.
yes, symbol and of the how a black man was enslaved. So they see the parallel with their own history, but that black man was freed and became a very important figure in Islam, and is respected throughout the Islamic world. And so that's a very appealing image, and a very appealing thing for people whose forefathers and foremothers have been enslaved and never got out of enslavement, and were never figures, as important figures in a world religion. So I think that for a lot of African Americans, that is a powerful symbol.
Just one thing about this terminology. Why is it that we, especially the African Americans, are willing to accept that title or that terminology, but we do not refer to the white people as European Americans? Do you think there's an element there that requires us to decolonize from Western terminology?
So the names of African Americans, the name that refer to them, or that they refer to themselves, it's a long story that is not finished. So it went from Negro to colored to black to African American, and African American. It's been there for about 30 years. And it was really the post-roots phenomenon, where people of African descent in the United States felt this link to Africa, and so wanted to stress this part of their heritage, and to recognize that they were not just Black Americans. So it was, black is just a color, sure, and we are bigger, than that. We came from Africa. So that was seen as very positive. Today, we're starting to go back, if you will, to Black
Americans. Okay.
Yes, and Black with capitals B. There's all this discussion today, and now the New York Times and AP and everybody is now capitalizing Black, just like they're capitalizing indigenous, etc. So as a reference to a group, to a community, to people, and meaning by Black, meaning people of African descent in Africa and in the diaspora. So
that is very, very fascinating indeed. We're coming towards the end, so just got a few more questions before we wrap up. How's your sort of research and your publications received within the academia and general public?
Yes, well, I wrote, for example, Servant of Allah. Just, I thought nobody's going to be interested in that, but I had to write it. And to my surprise, it's been an immense success. And, the reviews in academia were really, really extraordinary. And just, and then one day I saw that there was a review by Daniel Pipes. And and I thought, oh my God, this is going to be awful. It's going to demolish my old book and say, it's ridiculous. And to my utter surprise, he wrote a very positive, very, very well done review. It was really excellent, very smart. So I thought for a moment, did I do anything wrong, for him to have loved my book? So It was very well received to the point that we had, we did a 15th anniversary edition in 2013. One of the things that I regret, though, is that I wished it had been translated into French, because the people I'm writing about, those Muslims were people, from Senegal, from Guinea, from Mali, which are today kind of, in the French-speaking sphere, and they are, and France has the largest Muslim population in Europe.
Sure.
But it didn't work, and I wish also that there would be an Arabic translation of the book.
Well, let's hope that comes along soon. So is there any sort of new areas you're exploring, or you think there's any new projects you're working on?
Well, I think that in terms of, there's such much more to do about Muslims in the Americas. And for example, one of the things, a year or two ago, maybe a year ago, new manuscripts have appeared. Letters, two letters from one Senegalese was enslaved in the United States in the 1730s, have been found at the British Library, and manuscripts written by a man, Usman, in Georgia in the 1780s have been found also. So that is important. There is also the whole work of retranslating the manuscript that we have. There's still plenty of research to be done on the Muslims. And it's not something that I would do, but there's plenty of things. And right now,
that's an invitation to any of our listeners that can get in touch with you. Absolutely.
There's still a lot.
Well, that's excellent. It has been absolutely wonderful. The time has absolutely flown by. Thank you very much for joining us, Dr. Sylviane Diouf. And once again, let's hope that we can carry on with this great work. Thank you very much.
Thanks to you and to all the people who have listened.
Thank you very much.
This has been another episode of In Conversation, brought to you by Network Reorient, the podcast arm of Critical Muslim Studies. Thank you for tuning in. Have a listen to our other episodes and please leave a rating.